One of the most unique things about the Scream franchise is the mystery element that's involved when you're trying to figure out who the killer is. There have been so many different killers in the previous Scream movies, and not only do the fans try to figure out who they are, but also the characters in the movie. There are actually a lot of times when characters in the movie pinpoint who the killer is, but don't realize that they're right, or don't say that they're right, or don't go with the fact that they're right, or they just forget altogether. So this list is going to be naming the worst Scream detective and the best Scream detective out of all of the movies 1 through 6. This list is being ranked by the characters who I feel like figured out more killers, or just more about the killers, or even just found out who the killers were in a really interesting way. A lot of the characters have only ever figured out one killer, so a lot of it has to do with how they figured it out and how confident they were about that guess. And then some of the characters just figured out all of them. While there have been a lot of characters who did figure out who the killer was, some of them aren't as big. They're like they figured it out, so those are also going to be included in this. So bear with me, because some of these are definitely a stretch, but there haven't actually been like more than 10 people who have figured out who the ghost faces were, which I guess is a good thing because they want the viewers to figure it out. But a lot of them have actually really pinned some of these ghost faces down. I was kind of surprised finding what I did while looking back and seeing who had figured out stuff. So here we go, the top 10 Scream characters who pinned the killer. Number 10, Casey Becker. Now, Casey Becker didn't have a lot of time on screen, and of what she did, it was very monumental, being the first kill scene in the franchise, and her being the first main character victim. And she didn't really have a lot of time to figure anything out, but she did do something that no one else in the entire franchise has ever done to date, which is unmask the ghost face while being attacked. And that I had to give her props for and put her on this list, because no, she technically didn't figure anything out, but she did figure out who the ghost face was because she unmasked him right there. She's literally bleeding out, dying, and she decides to unmask him so that she knows who it is. So Casey Becker did end up finding out who the killer was before she died, but it's not that impressive, and it didn't really take a lot of skill for her to do so, which is why she's so low on the list. I do think maybe if she had been around, she might have been able to figure something out, just because she was so close to the people who did end up attacking her. While we know that Stu was her old boyfriend and Billy was a very good friend of his, so maybe she knew Billy as well as she did Stu. But she does get the number 10 spot for being the first person and the only person to unmask Ghostface while being attacked, and then did figure out who the killer was. So good job, Casey Becker. Number 9, Sidney Prescott. Now, Sidney, the Scream Queen herself, while she is the best person to fend off Ghostface killers and fight them in the final act, she's not very good at figuring out who the killer is, because over the 5 movies she's been in, she has really only figured out one, kind of. She hasn't really figured out more than that. She seems like she's usually more interested with not being involved in the Ghostface attacks than actually figuring out who it is, so I think maybe if she tried a little bit harder to figure it out, she probably would be able to, but figuring out the ghost face is definitely not Sidney's strength, while she does have a lot of strengths. However, she does figure out something, which is why she's on the list at number 9. She's able to kind of figure out that it's Billy, although I do think that the part where Billy drops the phone in her house is a little bit of a setup to put false suspicion on Billy so that Stu can then call her later and make it look like Billy isn't the killer. But she does ask him the question of like, oh, what did you do with your phone call, trying to catch him in a lie.
I don't know, when you're arrested, you're allowed one phone call, so I was just curious, who'd you call?
Called my dad.
No, Sheriff Burke called your dad. I saw him.
She is a little bit suspicious of him throughout and very distanced toward him throughout the whole movie. But by the end of the movie, she does kind of let him take advantage of her in her vulnerable state. So for that, like, you can't say that she really fully figured out it was Billy, because had she fully figured it out, she probably wouldn't have let herself get in that situation. So for that, she can't be any higher than she is on the list. But she does, to a degree, figure out that it's Billy, even though it's not very much. She also, like, barely figures out Mrs. Loomis, just with the fact that, like, right when she sees Mrs. Loomis, she knows it's Mrs. Loomis. but that doesn't really take any skill. It's kind of just the fact that she had known her while dating Billy, so I'm not sure that really counts as figuring out who a ghost face is, but she does figure out some things, and she's so strong in other categories in Scream, she doesn't really need to be good at figuring out who the killer is. She can let someone else do that. She can just fight Ghostface and take him down. That's probably what she should do with her life. Number 8, Samantha Carpenter. I feel like Samantha Carpenter is a little bit similar to Sidney in the fact that she also just doesn't really want to be involved with the killings at all and tries to distance herself rather than figuring out who the killer is. I guess in the 6th movie she does try to figure out who the killer is, but she does it along with the entire group full of all the killers. So like, how are you going to be able to catch the killer when you're using the killers to try to catch the killer? That doesn't really make any sense. But Samantha Carpenter in Scream 5 is very suspicious of Amber, kind of for the fact that she doesn't really like Amber, but she gets phone calls that are said from Amber Freeman, and when Tara goes to the party to get her inhaler and Amber asks her where they're going, Samantha tells her not to tell Amber because she doesn't trust her at all. So throughout the movie you can kind of see that she doesn't trust Amber, and Amber is definitely suspicious on her list, more than even Sidney with Billy, where Samantha wants nothing to do with Amber, and she doesn't really want Tara to be associated with Amber either, just because she's kind of creepy. Like, Amber is kind of obviously the killer. But Samantha does make the mistake of stopping at Amber's house to pick up Tara's extra inhaler, rather than just, like, going back to the hospital where no one suspicious is and getting that. So for that, she doesn't get to be as high on the list, but she does kind of figure out that it is Amber, and she definitely doesn't trust Amber throughout that film. Number 7, Kirby Reed. While Kirby doesn't really figure anything out in Scream 4, like, she totally falls for Charlie's trap, she totally falls for Jill's trap, she does not figure them out at all. In Scream 6, I feel like she does redeem herself a little bit by pinpointing Detective Bailey and realizing in that third act that he's not trustworthy. This is due to the fact that he is throwing suspicion on her and she knows she's not the killer, so why would he throw all that suspicion on her that much when he shouldn't know who the killer is? Like, it's kind of suspicious that he's doing that, which leads to her then thinking it's him. In the final act, when they're both holding each other at gunpoint, Kirby suggests that Wayne Bailey might be the killer, even though Samantha Carpenter and her sister don't really know who is telling the truth. Kirby is pretty convinced that he is the killer just because he's been telling them things that are not true about her, and why would he say that unless he is the killer?
Whatever he's been saying to you, don't listen to him. He's probably the killer.
So she did figure out who the killer was, but she also had a lot of evidence to do so. So that's why this one isn't as impressive, but she did know who the killer was and figured out that he was lying to the others about her. Other than that, Kirby doesn't really figure anything out, but she also doesn't know a lot of the other people, so it's kind of not her fault. I feel like they should have had her more involved in that movie than she was, just because she didn't have enough information, I feel like. But oh well, she figured out Wayne Bailey, and it ended up working out because they believed her and then they killed him, so that's fun. Number 6, Mark Kincaid. Mark Kincaid, again, isn't really a big part of Scream 3. He doesn't really do a whole lot because he's involved in Sidney's plotline, which is the lesser plotline of the movie because Sidney isn't in it as much. He does get the evidence of the person overhearing Roman Bridger on the phone and realizes that it might be Roman Bridger, although I'm still not really sure. Someone correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that might not have been intentional for Roman to get caught there because no one knew that he had the voice changer. So it's a little bit unclear to me whether he wanted Candy to know in that moment that it was him, or if he wanted it to like be caught and then it looks suspicious and then they find the voice changer. Like, I'm not really sure what his plan was there, because why would he make it sound like his voice if no one knew about the voice changer? But then they did end up finding the voice changer, but it also like was right before they ended up finding out Roman anyway. So I'm really unsure about that, and I would love to know if someone knows the answer to that question. But Detective Bailey, or what? Detective Bailey. Detective Mark Kincaid takes Roman in for questioning because he does overhear this, and I'm pretty sure he is suspicious of him after that. But again, it's not really clear. He does like pinpoint Roman, which is why I'm giving him some credit for that. He does also have sufficient evidence because someone overheard Roman's voice, but you know what? He's at least doing his job, so that's like a good thing. I feel like some of the other cops don't do anything, so for the cop character in the movie, he does do something there that is somewhat helpful, so good for him. Number 5, Wayne Bailey. Now, it's kind of weird having Wayne Bailey on this list because he did end up getting revealed as the killer, and obviously I'm not going to include any killers knowing that they are the killer because, like, that's pretty easy to figure out. So the reason Wayne Bailey is on this list is not because he figured out that he was the killer in his group. In Scream 6, there's 2 sets of Ghostface killers, so I'm putting him this high on this list because he already knew that he was the killer and his kids were the killers, he figured out that the other 2, Jason and Greg, were also a Ghostface killer duo. Which is actually pretty impressive because when you're the killer, you're not really looking to figure out who any killers are. Especially they found it out before they had killed anyone, which is really impressive. The Kirsch family must have somehow figured out that Jason and Greg were planning on doing kills. They say that they're doing it to finish Richie's film, which I'm not sure if that has to do with how they figured it out. Maybe Ethan somehow knew about it because he was probably friends with them. I am giving this credit to Wayne Bailey instead of the other 2 just because I know that he's kind of the leader of that Ghostface group. And he's gonna get the credit for doing that. He's the one who led it. He's probably the one who figured it out, just being a cop. Although I could see maybe Ethan figuring it out just because he might have been friends with them. I do also believe that Detective Bailey was the one who killed Jason and Greg. But this one's kind of higher on the list than I expected it to be because it's really impressive, honestly, that he figured out that these nobody killers who didn't even kill anyone yet were Ghostface killers and planned their murder before Jason even had been able to kill someone, because by the time he gets home, Greg is already dead in the freezer, and Detective Bailey is already in his house ready to kill him, and he hacks their phone number to make it seem like it's coming from Greg, maybe hacks the cameras, I'm still not sure. He also might just have been looking while he was there, like we know he was in the house at the time, so he could have just watched Jason that way. But yeah, Detective Bailey totally figured it out, and he totally deserves to be on this list. Number 4, Dewey Riley. Dewey, I think, while he didn't figure out a whole lot of ghost faces, has the best, like one of the best pinpoints of a ghost face in the entire franchise, where he immediately, right upon meeting Richie, figures out that he's the killer. After 2 minutes of knowing Samantha and Richie, he starts questioning Samantha on how long she's known him and where they met and stuff about it, because he already doesn't trust Richie, and the first rule that he gives them is never trust the love interest.
Well, there's certain rules to surviving a stab movie. Believe me, I know. Rule number 1, never trust the love interest.
I feel like that's one of the best cases, and it does end up being Richie, and it's like really, really impressive that he was able to pinpoint it as well as he did, even though throughout it he doesn't really stick to that. While he does save Richie in the hospital, and he doesn't act like he doesn't trust Richie, because he said that he obviously didn't trust Richie, and he did figure it out immediately. So I was really shocked when Richie ended up being the killer, because they literally tell you with Dewey right in that moment, right when he walks in to meet Dewey. This really is Dewey's only moment where he figures out a Ghostface killer, but it's so impressive, I put him at number 4, so good job, Dewey, you figured one out. Number 3, Mindy Meeks Martin. Mindy is someone who actually surprised me because she didn't figure out as many Ghostface as I thought she did, because she didn't figure out either of them really in the first one because she didn't know Richie, and she kind of suspected Amber in the basement, but I feel like she didn't act like that, because why would you follow the killer alone in the basement if you actually did feel like it was them? So I don't think she really gets any credit for figuring either of them out in Scream 5, which she admits in Scream 6.
As terrifying as this all is, I'm actually glad I get a chance to redeem myself for not calling the killers last time.
But in Scream 6, she definitely figures out something. So one thing she really figures out is that it's Ethan, because she totally suspects him the whole time. She calls him Ghostface, her and Chad kind of, but mainly Mindy is driving this thought, and she's always like, oh, I don't trust Ethan. She tells him that he's the number 1 on her list. No matter what he does, she never trusts him, and so she really gets credit for actually acting upon how she feels about him being the killer. A lot of the other people on this list, while they guess who they think is the killer, they don't act like that throughout the movie, and Mindy is one of the only people to actually act like she doesn't trust Ethan. She stays away from him, and she doesn't want to be left alone with him, and that's really smart of her to do. And not only does she figure out Ethan, but she also figures out Detective Bailey, because in the 3rd act, while this isn't really explained, she runs up after all the stuff has already been done and says, I know who the killer is, it's Ethan and Bailey. For some reason, she thinks it's Ethan and Bailey and not Bailey and Quinn because they're related. That would make more sense if she would have figured that out. But for some reason, she knew it was Ethan and Bailey, and she totally was right, except that she was missing Quinn. So she got 2 out of 3. That's not bad. But I'm still a little bit upset that this isn't explained how she figured it out, because I feel like there was no connection that made sense to Ethan and Bailey being the killers together. Like, there was no reason for that. So, like, what conclusion did she get to thinking that? The only thing that I think could have happened is that Ethan had to give away that he was the Ghostface because he had to get to the theater. So he kind of leaves her there dead on the side of the subway and leaves. So maybe he was like called by Detective Bailey and she overheard him on the phone and he was like, oh, okay, I'll get there and we'll go kill the Carpenters or something. That's the only thing I feel like makes sense. But then again, that would mean that Mindy didn't actually figure out who it was. But she did already think it was Ethan, so something had to connect that to Bailey. Well, I'm not sure what that is, and this is why she can't be first on the list, but also, like, she's not first on the list. It's not explained how she figured it out, but she did figure out a huge part of the killers in Scream 6, so she gets spot number 3. Number 2, Gale Weathers. Now, Gale actually figures out quite a bit in this franchise, and it's like the randomest batch of, like, information that she gets from all the different movies she's been in. She's the only like actual character besides the Ghostface voice to be in every movie, so she's had a lot of opportunities to figure out things, and boy did she. The first thing that Gale figures out that's huge, one of the biggest discoveries in the entire Scream franchise, which is kind of what gets it started, is that Cotton Weary wasn't the killer who killed Maureen Prescott. The fact that she writes a book on this and has all these theories and all these like proven facts that she's found and puts it together, and the fact that she is right about it is wild and one of the best things that anyone's ever figured out in the entire Scream franchise. Because obviously if Billy would have revealed to Sidney, oh, I was the one who killed your mother, it would have been found out. But Gale didn't need any of that. She figured all that out by herself. She figured out that Cotton wasn't the killer. Well, she didn't figure out who the killer was. She took that big step into figuring out who that killer was, and that was really important to be able to do that. And so I wanted to give credit to her for doing this, because that is a huge part. Even though it technically isn't figuring out who the killer is, it literally should count, because that's really impressive. The police didn't even figure out that it wasn't Cotton Weary, so she gets a lot of credit for that. The next Ghostface that she figures out in the Scream franchise is Jill Roberts in Scream 4, which I think this is one of the coolest ways that someone has figured out who the Ghostface is. And what happens is Jill's in the hospital. She mentions that her and Gale have matching wounds, but she shouldn't be able to know that. So Dewey goes and tells Gale, oh, she said something about your matching wounds. And Gale goes, how did she know that we had matching wounds? And then she's able to figure out that Jill was actually the killer. And the reason that this is so impressive is because at that point, they think that they already know who the killers are, which is Trevor and Charlie. So they're not even looking for another killer. Like, they shouldn't be even on that radar. But of course, Gale Weathers, while she's sitting there in the hospital bed stabbed, is still trying to figure out the mystery and ends up saving the day, honestly. Because Sidney would have died had she not figured that out in that exact moment. I mean, seriously, how does she even think that on the spot, that she shouldn't know that they have matching wounds? Like, I would have never figured that out and did not figure that out when I first watched the movie, so props to her. And the last thing she does, while small and kind of written off as a joke, is really impressive. In Scream 5, she figures out that it's Amber when Amber walks on the porch and she's like making a scene about how she's been stabbed.
Oh, he stabbed me!
What do you think? Trap.
And she knows immediately that Amber is lying. She doesn't even take a second to think about it. She just knows at this point. Like, at this point, she can just figure it out without even thinking and just looking at one situation. She wasn't even there. They come to the Act 3 late, which is so funny. They arrived late to the Act 3, which isn't even allowed, but it happens. And then she figures out that Amber is the killer. So that's really, I thought that was really fun, and total props to her because she knew it was a trap and she was absolutely right. Before I say the number 1 on this list, please, if there's anyone I missed or maybe some details that I might have missed, let me know who you think figured out the most in the Scream franchise of who was the killer and pinning who it was, what they did, who the partner was. Let me know what you think, because there's so many details that I've probably not thought about because there's so many movies and the franchise is huge. But yeah, let me know in the comments below who you think figured out who the killer was the best. Number 1, Randy Meeks. Now, Randy wasn't around for a long time. He was only in Scream 1 and Scream 2, and technically Scream 3, but not really. No one has ever matched him in his ability to figure out who the killer is, because he literally almost figures out every single killer that is in his time of being alive. In Scream 1, he pinpoints Stu Macher in the first scene that he's introduced in, because he literally turns to Stu asking him about how he gutted Casey Becker and comments on the comments that he is making. Stu is making some pretty obvious comments in this scene, so it's kind of surprising that the other people didn't pick up on it, but Randy Meeks totally picks up on his little moments he's saying in that opening scene and kind of turns towards Stu and puts blame on him and asks him where he was last night when Casey Becker was killed. So he totally is able to figure out Stu Macher in that opening scene, while he doesn't act like that in the rest of the movie, because he does confide in Stu for some of his theories, which is so stupid, but he does figure out that it is Stu, so props to him for that. And obviously he knows that it's Billy Loomis that entire movie. He talks about the boyfriend, the idea of the boyfriend, how he's the killer, how he's creepy, how he acts like a killer, how he shouldn't be in the murder section of the store, whatever he's doing. Randy makes so many comments about Billy being the killer. While I do think some of that might be stemming from the fact that he's jealous that he's with Sidney, I think he does actually know that Billy is the killer, and he tries to warn everyone about that. He does also actually figure out Stu is the killer in the last act, although I don't think that requires any skill. I think he either saw him with his mask off or just like saw him stab someone. So he does know that it's Stu before Stu technically reveals himself. But he really does figure them both out before that final moment, which is really impressive already. And then in Scream 2, he mentions that Derek might be the killer, but he says the boyfriend is tired, so he literally says that Derek he doesn't think is the killer, and then he talks about how it's Mickey because he's the freaky film student. He does brush this off a little bit quickly, but the fact that he does mention Mickey as a killer in that moment, telling the audience that we should be suspicious of him, is just crazy. And then you may be thinking, oh, he didn't figure out Mrs. Loomis, but he actually kind of did. When he's sitting there talking with Dewey about who the killers are, he mentions how the killer could be a girl by mentioning Hallie. Dewey says that the killer is usually white males, and Randy mentions that it could be a female because that would be against the rules, but not really.
It's sort of against the rules, but not really. Mrs. Voorhees was a terrific serial killer, and there's always room for Candyman's daughter. She's sweet, she's deadly, she's bad for your teeth.
And then he goes on saying how Mrs. Voorhees in Friday the 13th was a terrific serial killer, and kind of talks about the idea that Mrs. Loomis is in this Scream 2 movie. So while he doesn't pinpoint Mrs. Loomis, because I don't think he ever speaks to her throughout Scream 2, he does kind of say the idea of her being the killer, which I feel like is almost figuring it out. So basically he pinpoints every killer that he could have throughout his time being alive in the Scream franchise, which is crazy. And even to go further, in Scream 3, he literally talks about how the killer in that movie will go back to what happened before, unveiling secrets that hadn't been revealed, which is what happens with Roman. So he's not even alive at that point, and he still figures out something about the killer. Well, yes, he doesn't figure out who the killer is, but he's literally like dead, and he figures out stuff, which is wild. No one has ever come close to figuring out what Randy has figured out in these movies, and it's really unfortunate that he died as early as he did, because he probably would have figured out a killer in every single movie. So maybe they did a good thing by killing him early, because it would have been spoiled, because he would have figured it out. Anyway, that's my list for the top 10 people who figured out who the killer was in Scream. There were more of them than I thought they were, although some of these were a little bit of a stretch. And shout out to Randy for figuring out everything. So that's really impressive. And I have not ever figured out who both killers were in each movie, or in Scream 3, I didn't figure out who the one killer was. I basically am not the Randy when it comes to Scream. So good for him. But yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought of this list, what your list would be, and if there's anything that I missed, because something tells me that there probably is something I missed, because there's a lot of details when it comes to figuring out who the killer is in Scream. But yeah, that's it for today. Goodbye.